Washington, D.C. has always been a city of power and politics, but beneath its polished surface, there have been figures who operated in the shadows, shaping the city's history in ways most people never knew. In this video, we will dive into the stories of the top 6 most influential and dangerous figures who controlled underground empires, rising to power with sheer force, cunning, and strategy. These men, with their ruthless ambition and iron grip, dominated the streets of the nation's capital, leaving a legacy that still echoes today. Number 6. Michael Salters. Michael Frey Salters was a significant figure in the streets of Washington, D.C., particularly during the volatile and chaotic 1980s and 1990s, a period marked by a sharp rise in substance trade and violence. His reputation as a feared and respected figure is etched into the criminal lore of D.C., a man who lived by his word and operated in the shadows, but wielded immense influence over the city's underworld. Frey came up in the game when the city was deep in the grip of substance trafficking, with Washington, D.C. being one of the largest hubs for the trade on the East Coast. While many others were rising through the ranks, Frey took on a position of authority, guiding the actions of those around him with a combination of cunning, charisma, and a willingness to mediate disputes when needed. He wasn't a man who could simply be ignored, nor was he a figure to be trifled with. When issues between rival factions, particularly in the D.C. areas like Trinidad, became too heated, Frey was often called in to intervene. His approach was simple. He would talk to the men involved, not out of weakness, but because his presence carried weight. When a deadly conflict between rival groups threatened to tear apart the business in the streets, it was Frey who helped negotiate a ceasefire. His reputation alone was enough to convince the young, hungry men of the streets to listen. By the late 1980s, Frey was working alongside other powerful figures in D.C., like Rayful Edmond, the notorious Kingpin who had a vice-like grip on the city's substance trade. While Rayful dominated the narcotic network, Frey kept his own presence in the game strong. He wasn't just a middleman, he was an architect, arranging deals, controlling turf, and maintaining a calm demeanor amidst the storm of street violence that swept through the city. He had a knack for both business and strategy, always in tune with the dynamics of the streets. It was said that Frey's influence was so extensive that he was even involved in brokering deals between major dealers in D.C., pooling money with others like Rayful and his partner Tony Lewis to secure larger quantities of substances. He understood the intricacies of the game and leveraged relationships to expand his reach, making sure that business continued smoothly while keeping rivalries from escalating to the point of no return. Frey's loyalty to his people was both a strength and a vulnerability. He was known to have a deep sense of humor, always taking care of those who were loyal to him. But this loyalty also left him open to betrayal. Some members of his own camp, people he trusted, began to envy his position. Tensions arose, and this would eventually lead to Frey's downfall. In March of 1993, a grand jury indictment accused Frey and his associates of involvement in several grave incidents. By this time, Frey had drawn the attention of both law enforcement and his rivals. But the most significant threat came from within. The infamous figure Alpo, who had become notorious for his ruthless behavior and later betrayal, allegedly feared that Frey was planning to reclaim control over the city's streets. In an act of calculated desperation, Alpo orchestrated a plot to have Frey eliminated. The plan unfolded in the summer of 1991, when Frey was ambushed and left gravely injured after being shot multiple times while driving his car. His demise marked a turning point in the D.C. underworld. Frey's passing shook the streets of D.C. He had been a man who earned the respect of all, and his absence left a void. Those who knew him, both allies and adversaries, spoke of his integrity in the game, how he played by a code and never betrayed anyone. Number 5. Alpo Martinez is a figure whose life became infamous in the world of crime. Raised in a Puerto Rican family in the tough streets of Harlem, Alpo was introduced to illicit activities at a young age. By 13, he was already involved in selling substances, quickly earning a reputation as a rising player in the criminal underworld. His ambitions took him far beyond Harlem, leading him to expand his operations to Washington, D.C. in the late 1980s. There, he grew his network and established himself as one of the most feared figures in the narcotic trade. In Washington, D.C., Martinez forged a partnership with Wayne "Silk" Perry, a notorious enforcer known for his ruthlessness. With Perry by his side, Martinez's empire expanded, and he became a major supplier of substances. His success was built not only on his ability to distribute vast quantities of substances, but also on his brutal willingness to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. Martinez's reign was marked by violence, as he would go to extreme lengths to protect his territory and ensure his dominance in the narcotic trade. He was involved in numerous violent incidents, including the tragic demise of his close friend and business partner, Rich Porter, in 1990. Porter's demise was a pivotal moment in Martinez's life, reflecting his ability to betray even those closest to him for the sake of business. He later admitted that his decision to turn on Porter was purely business, emphasizing his cold, calculating nature. As his operations continued to expand, Martinez's reputation grew, but so did the law's scrutiny. In 1991, his criminal activities finally caught up with him. On November 7, 1991, he was arrested in Washington, D.C., facing a host of charges, including conspiracy, racketeering, and multiple counts related to the deaths of several individuals connected to his criminal empire. Faced with the prospect of a life sentence or even the death penalty, Martinez decided to cooperate with authorities. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he became an informant, implicating his associates, including his former enforcer, Wayne Perry, whose conviction resulted in multiple life sentences. Martinez's testimony dismantled much of the drug network in D.C., but it also made him a target. His decision to cooperate with law enforcement branded him as a traitor in the eyes of many. In 1994, Alpo Martinez was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple charges, including involvement in several violent incidents. He was incarcerated at the high-security ADX Florence facility in Colorado, where he would serve time for his crimes. While in prison, Martinez's decision to cooperate with authorities remained a point of contention. He lived with the constant threat of retaliation, knowing that his role as an informant had sealed his reputation among his former associates. However, in 2015, after serving nearly 2 decades, Martinez was released from prison. His cooperation with authorities had earned him a place in the Federal Witness Protection Program, where he was given a new identity and relocated to Lewiston, Maine, under the name Abraham G. Rodriguez. Martinez's need for validation and the lure of his old life led him to return to the very streets that once made him infamous. His attempts to reconnect with his past were dangerous, and many believed they would ultimately be his downfall. On October 31, 2021, those fears became a reality. Early that morning, Martinez was shot multiple times while driving through Harlem in a red Dodge Ram. The attack occurred in what appeared to be a targeted strike, possibly linked to a grudge he had unknowingly sparked months earlier when he had a confrontation with a man named Shaquem Parker. Parker, angered by an incident involving Martinez, took matters into his own hands, gunning down the former Kingpin in broad daylight. Martinez, who had spent years hiding behind a false identity, had been found and was no longer able to escape his past. Number 4. Melvin Butler. Melvin Butler, a name synonymous with the dark days of Washington, D.C. As criminal underworld in the late 1980s, was a key figure in one of the most notorious narcotic networks in U.S. history. A top associate of Rayful Edmond III, Butler's rise through the ranks of the city's criminal scene came with bloodshed, deception, and a ruthless pursuit of wealth. His criminal career unfolded during a time when the city was grappling with a severe increase in substance distribution, which fueled widespread violence. Butler's connection to Edmond, often considered one of the most infamous figures in DC's criminal history, began in the late 1980s. The two men met in Las Vegas in 1987 during the aftermath of a high-profile boxing match. This encounter would prove to be the catalyst for a partnership that would soon flood the streets of DC with dangerous substances, directly contributing to the violence that engulfed the city. By 1989, Butler was arrested and charged for his role in the sprawling trafficking network that Edmond had built. This network not only imported vast quantities of substances, but also employed a small army of enforcers who were responsible for maintaining control over the territory. Edmond's operations were prolific, controlling about 20% of the city's substance trade, generating profits that reportedly reached $1 million a week. These profits came with an enormous cost to the city, as rivalries between different factions led to numerous violent encounters. Butler, as one of Edmond's top lieutenants, played a central role in these activities. He was tasked with managing key connections, particularly those tied to suppliers from Los Angeles and Colombia, which helped ensure the steady flow of substances into the capital. In 1989, Butler's activities were finally brought to light when law enforcement officials apprehended him, and he was charged with major offenses tied to the distribution network. At the time of his arrest, Butler was only 24 years old, yet his criminal actions had already earned him the label of a top-tier offender in the narcotic trade. His involvement in this vast operation was not limited to logistics. He also played a crucial role in orchestrating the strategic elements that kept Edmond's network running smoothly. With more than 150 people working under Edmond's banner, Butler was among the highest-ranking members, trusted with crucial decisions and operations that sustained the network's success. The trial that followed Butler's arrest was nothing short of dramatic. In a city that was already on edge due to rampant violence, the case of Melvin Butler and Rayful Edmond captivated the public. The courtroom was equipped with bulletproof glass for protection, and Edmond himself was flown in daily by helicopter from a military base due to concerns about his safety. Ultimately, Butler was convicted of multiple charges related to his role in the operation. Initially sentenced to life imprisonment, his sentence was later reduced to 34 years on appeal. Butler's incarceration did not go unnoticed. His case became emblematic of the era's tough-on-crime approach, which sought to dismantle powerful drug networks and deter future offenders. However, as time passed and sentencing laws evolved, questions arose about the fairness of such lengthy sentences for individuals like Butler, who had already served more than half his life behind bars. In recent years, as part of a broader effort to reform sentencing policies, Butler sought to have his sentence reduced. The U.S. Sentencing Commission in 2014 approved guidelines that allowed inmates to request sentence reductions based on changed circumstances or revised laws. Butler sought to benefit from these reforms, arguing that he was no longer the same person he was at the time of his conviction. His attorney highlighted that Butler had served over 25 years in prison, a period during which he had seemingly distanced himself from his former violent lifestyle. Despite these arguments, the request was met with skepticism. U.S. District Judge Royce C. Lamberth, who was overseeing the case, expressed concerns about the potential for reducing sentences for individuals like Butler, who had been instrumental in one of the city's most violent and destructive narcotic networks. Butler's fate, however, remains uncertain. Although he may have a chance at early release, his actions during the peak of the city's narcotic crisis have left an indelible mark. As of the latest updates, Butler's release is expected in way back 2017, but the future remains fraught with complexities surrounding his rehabilitation and potential reintegration into society. While some details of Butler's current life remain private, there have been no indications that he has not been released, and he is likely still serving his sentence in the federal system. So, as of the time of compiling this story, Melvin Butler, his official whereabout is not certain or publicized. Number 3. Tony Lewis. Tony Lewis grew up in the streets of Washington, D.C., in the shadow of poverty and struggle, a harsh upbringing that shaped his life choices early on. By the time he was 17, he was deeply involved in the illicit world of substance distribution. Desperate to escape the economic hardships of his youth, he turned to the streets to find a way to provide for his family, and over time, his name became associated with one of the most infamous crime figures of the 1980s, Rayful Edmond. Together, they built a powerful and dangerous empire that gripped Washington, D.C. in fear. Lewis Sr.'s rise to infamy was fast and lethal in terms of influence. At the time, his operations were linked to distributing illegal substances across the city, and his role made him a significant figure in the underworld. As his wealth and control grew, his lifestyle transformed. He moved his family out of the decaying neighborhoods that he grew up in and into the more affluent suburbs. The young Lewis Jr. experienced the luxury of designer clothes, private schools, and even trips to sports games, all funded by his father's dangerous endeavors. However, behind the lavish lifestyle was a man at the helm of a powerful network, deeply embedded in a criminal world that was responsible for fueling the chaos in D.C. communities. In 1989, Tony Lewis Sr. was indicted as part of a 29-person conspiracy that involved a sprawling illegal substance network. The charges brought against him were severe, accusing him of leading criminal operations that significantly contributed to the violence and addiction that plagued the city. Although Lewis Sr. wasn't directly linked to violent crimes, the web of activities he was part of left devastation in its wake. His influence in the network made him a central figure, marking him as a dangerous individual. The court found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole at the age of 26. During his 34 years in federal custody, Lewis Sr.'s name remained a symbol of the era that witnessed the rise of illegal trade and its far-reaching consequences. He spent decades behind bars, watching his son, Tony Lewis Jr., grow from a boy into a man. Throughout these years, Lewis Jr. never gave up on his father. He tirelessly advocated for his release, organizing rallies, engaging in prison reform activism, and leveraging public support for justice reform. The Free Tony Lewis movement gained traction, and it was clear that Lewis Sr. had the support of his family and community. One of the most pivotal moments in this campaign came in 2021, when a rally was held at Black Lives Matter Plaza, drawing attention to the broader issues of mass incarceration and unjust sentencing. The breakthrough for Lewis Sr. came in the form of the First Step Act, a Trump-era federal criminal justice reform initiative that allowed some offenders to seek reduced sentences. After multiple legal attempts, his attorney filed a successful motion, and a judge granted his release. He was 60 years old. His son drove to the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, to bring him home. After more than 3 decades, Tony Lewis Sr. was finally free. The long-anticipated reunion between father and son was an emotional one, capturing the bittersweet reality of their long separation. Number 2. Wayne Perry, better known as Silk Perry, was one of the most feared figures in Washington, D.C. during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Raised in the tough neighborhoods of Southwest D.C., often referred to as Drama City or Chocolate City, Perry's early life was steeped in hardship. Born on November 14, 1962, he grew up in an environment rife with poverty, crime, and violence, with his own brother falling victim to violence in 1979. This tragic event helped shape Perry's hardened worldview. From a young age, Wayne was drawn into the world of street crime. At just 12 years old, he started working as a lookout for older gang members who were involved in illegal activities. By the time he was 13, Perry was already involved in more serious crime, including substance trafficking, extortion, and robbery. His early criminal activities were marked by a rapid ascent through the criminal ranks, and by the time he was 16, he had already committed his first bank robbery. Despite being expelled from multiple schools due to violent behavior and trouble with authorities, Perry's reputation continued to grow. His talent for sports earned him the nickname Silk from his half-brother, but it was his ruthless nature and connection to the criminal underworld that made him infamous. By the time he was in his late teens, Perry had become notorious for his ability to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of his criminal enterprise. His nickname, King of Killers, was an evidence to his reputation for handling problems with extreme measures. Wayne Perry was closely associated with one of the most notorious drug dealers of the time, Alpo Martinez, who was known for his ruthless control of the narcotic trade in Harlem, New York. Perry became both a close associate and enforcer for Martinez's operations, which were centered on the distribution of substances in Washington, D.C. and other areas. Their partnership was built on violence and fear. Perry was not just a bodyguard, but also served as a fixer for Martinez, handling matters involving disloyal associates, rival dealers, and anyone else who posed a threat to their business. Perry's methods were particularly brutal. He was known for executing tasks with cold efficiency, eliminating those who could potentially jeopardize the operation without hesitation. In 1984, Perry's brutal nature came to light when he assassinated a fellow gang member who had tried to ambush him. The murder occurred right in front of a police car, though the officers on duty testified it was an act of self-defense. Perry was sent to Lorton's Youth Center, one of the most notorious prisons in the U.S., where he further honed his violent reputation. When he was released in 1987, he continued his work as a hitman and bodyguard for Martinez, further cementing his place in the underworld. The partnership between Perry and Martinez proved lucrative but dangerous. By the early 1990s, Perry was heavily involved in the execution of multiple violent acts to maintain control over their narcotic operations. Martinez, who had become a major narcotic trafficker, was able to rely on Perry to handle situations that required extreme measures. Their activities led to a string of violent events, including the elimination of several rivals and witnesses, making both Perry and Martinez among the most feared individuals in the criminal world. However, the alliance would eventually unravel. In 1991, Martinez was arrested by federal authorities. Faced with a long sentence, Martinez made a deal with the government. To reduce his sentence, he provided the authorities with crucial information about Perry's activities, including the assassination of key figures in their operations. In 1992, Perry was arrested and charged with a range of crimes, including manslaughter, conspiracy, and racketeering. His trial in 1993 revealed that he had been involved in at least 8 assassinations, most of which were carried out to further the interests of his criminal enterprise. Despite the severity of his crimes, Perry struck a deal with the authorities. In exchange for testifying against Martinez, he avoided the death penalty and instead received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Wayne Perry was sent to the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, where he remains to this day. His sentence ensures that he will never be released. Number 1. Rayful Edmond. Rayful Edmond III, born on November 26, 1964, is a former criminal figure in Washington, D.C., who rose to infamy in the 1980s for his involvement in one of the most significant narcotic trafficking operations in U.S. history. During the height of the crack epidemic, Edmond played a pivotal role in the distribution of large quantities of illegal substances in the D.C. area, contributing to a surge in criminal activity and violence that earned the city the nickname, the murder capital of America. His empire spanned across several states and linked him to international trafficking networks, including ties to Colombian cartels. Edmond's criminal career began at a young age. Although he was an athletic, charismatic young man with a reputation for being well-liked, his family's ties to the criminal world eventually pulled him into the illicit substance trade. By the late 1980s, Edmond had established himself as a key figure in the D.C. narcotic scene, coordinating the distribution of substances from Colombian suppliers to local dealers in the city. At his peak, Edmond was reportedly moving between 1,000 and 2,000 kilos of substances each week, generating millions of dollars in profits. His operation was not just large in scale, but also deadly. Edmond employed a network of 150 individuals, and his organization was associated with numerous violent events, some of which led to loss of life. Authorities linked his group to at least 30 violent incidents in a single year. The high volume of illegal substances flowing through D.C. caused an explosion in violent crime as rival factions competed for control of the lucrative market. Despite being a relatively young man, Edmond's ability to maintain control of his operations and keep his associates loyal made him a force to be reckoned with. On April 15, 1989, he was arrested at the age of 24. His trial attracted significant attention, with authorities taking extreme measures to ensure the safety of those involved. Security was so tight that jurors' identities were kept anonymous, and the courtroom was fortified with bulletproof glass. Edmond was convicted on multiple federal charges, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy to distribute and possess illegal substances, and racketeering. In 1990, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even while incarcerated, Edmond continued to engage in criminal activity. He was caught coordinating deals from within the walls of the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, working with Colombian contacts and associates to keep his operations running. Edmond's relationship with law enforcement took a surprising turn. He began cooperating with authorities, providing information that led to the arrest of dozens of individuals involved in the illicit trade. Edmond's cooperation not only resulted in convictions, but also helped improve prison security to prevent further trafficking behind bars. Edmond's cooperation with the government had significant ramifications. His testimony helped authorities convict over 100 individuals involved in narcotic distribution, and his assistance in several cold case investigations earned him a reduced sentence. In 2021, after serving over 2 decades, Edmond's sentence was reduced to 20 years. He also benefited from a reduction in his 30-year sentence in Pennsylvania due to his continued cooperation. As of 2024, after serving more than 35 years in custody, Edmond was transferred to a halfway house in Nashville, Tennessee, in preparation for his eventual release in 2025.